Okay, so I want to take a quick census here. How many people here do not maintain any Selenium tests right now? How many people maintain 100 or fewer? How many people maintain between 100 and 1,000? 1,000 to 10,000. Tests. So if you were to run all of your tests serially, how many people would take less than 100 hours to run their tests? How many people take over 100 hours to run their tests? Oh, I picked a bad number. All right. How many people here are the tests written by a QA department, people in the QA department, maintained by people in the QA? How many people it's the developer's job or people working specifically with the developers on a development team? Okay, there's a good mix there. All right, languages, .NET. Java, Python, JavaScript, and Ruby. Okay, great, great. How many people just test on Chrome? How many people just test on Firefox? How many people test on both Chrome and Firefox? And IE. Okay, there, happy. How many people run on a local grid? How many people run on an outsourced platform like Sauce Labs or Browser Stack? Okay. How many people just run locally on a MacBook sitting in the corner? See, yeah, yeah. All right. There's been a lot of changes this past year, so we're just going to go through where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. If you Google steel cage knife fight, you will see a video of Simon Stewart and Jason Huggins discussing the pros and cons between Selenium and and WebDriver. Water was, so if you look at the first commit in a repo, CVS that got ported to GitHub, Water's first commit was in 2003. The code itself was kind of around a little earlier than that from some Ruby code that someone wrote with calm settings. It was named Water in 2004 after one of the Agile conferences that you guys went to, and that was right around the time. So both Brad.
It was the XP Agile Universe Conference in Calgary.
Oh, Calgary, okay.
Yeah, it was a Canadian event. So Canadians here?
Oh, a few Canadians, yeah, there we go. So Brett and Jason Huggins both worked at ThoughtWorks, and Jason was working on Selenium at the time. This was in 2004. Selenium wasn't really open sourced until 2005, or at least that's when the first commits were on there. And then WebDriver, the steel cage knife fight, was 2007 GTAC that was talked about. So it's 10 years beyond all of these. Water back in the day was Windows only, Internet Explorer only, Ruby only. It was a lower level library, so it had more access to the internals. And it was a pretty clean API because it was very object oriented, and it made a lot of sense. Selenium 1.0 had the advantage of working on multiple operating systems and multiple browsers. The problem with it is it was a JavaScript implementation, which means it had issues with cross-site scripting and SSL and things that JavaScript could not get around for good reason. So it was a higher level framework. There were a lot of ways to do a lot of things with similar but different syntax, and it was less object oriented. And so the industry was finding there were some issues with that. For all of its positive things, the implementation made things a little difficult. And so they decided that WebDriver and Selenium were going to merge, and so Selenium 2.0 was essentially a rewrite of the Selenium code to use the WebDriver API. The WebDriver also was multi-platform and multi-language, but each browser on each operating system needed its own little server that you would send commands to that would then interact with the browser. Again, a lower level library, so it had better access to the internals. It was more object oriented than Selenium RC. but Selenium 2 still continued to support Selenium RC. So that's where we have been, where we are. Selenium 3 was no more RC. That was it's what we would say in our IRC chat room. Someone would say something IRC, and then everyone would respond, no more IRC, or no more RC. Selenium 3 was essentially Selenium 2 minus Selenium 1. We took out all of the Selenium 1 code, and there were no specific API changes that went into Selenium 3. But around the time that we were converting over to Selenium 3 and rewriting all of the grid and the server stuff that had a lot of that code mashed together, it took a while to pull all of that out. During that time, Apple released a Safari driver. The previous Safari driver was written by the open source community in the Selenium project, and it hadn't been maintained in several years. And so for Selenium 3, we no longer allow you to use the old driver because it was old. And we wanted you to have a problem with Safari and talk to Apple to get your issue addressed instead of the open source community. And so we default changed that. Well, anyone using Safari, your tests were going to break because different things were implemented better with Apple's version than with the original version. At the same time, also, a bigger issue was Firefox, which is the default browser, also decided that they needed to improve security in their browser. And by improving the security, and it was also the way they siloed their processes now, you can't run the original implementation, the legacy Firefox driver, in Firefox 48 or above. So if you're running with Firefox 48 or above, your only option is to use the new Gecko driver. And the new Gecko driver is not yet feature complete. And so there were a lot of people that updated their Firefox and had a lot of problems trying to run their tests to get their test passing. The recommendation, for the most part, still is to downgrade your Firefox to use Firefox ESR, the extended support release, which I think right now is 45, and to use that with your, you can use that with Selenium 3 by passing in a parameter, but it caused confusion because people were thinking, oh, that's part of Selenium 3 is getting rid of Safari and Firefox and all of these things. They just happened to coincide with the release of Selenium 3. All right, and Water 6 was released as well, based on Selenium 3. It's all Selenium now. It's no longer an alternate implementation in any fashion, which was what the Water Classic was. Whereas Selenium is a do-what-I-say browser automation tool, Water is much more of a do-what-I-mean test automation tool. We added a bunch of new features to Water to make it much easier to use. Better stale element collection handling, automatic waits, new locators, and better error messages. All right, so the drivers, the status of each of the browsers right now. Chrome has been maintained by Google. It's been maintained by the browser vendor the longest. And so it is very stable. Whenever Google updates to a new version of their browser that breaks something in their driver, they release a new driver. And so they are able to keep those two in lockstep, and the open source community doesn't have to do anything about it. Firefox, the legacy version, the open source community was maintaining the driver, and Mozilla was maintaining their browser. And so Mozilla would make some changes to their browser, it would get released, and everyone would complain that their tests were broken because the Selenium community needed to update the code that would make that version of Firefox work, and that means getting a new release of Selenium out, and sometimes getting everything passing and good took a while. So there were those frustrations. With this new Gecko driver that Firefox has, Mozilla has, Mozilla can now do what Google has been doing, which is keep their driver version and their browser version in sync going forward. Internet Explorer has had an open source implementation of their driver pretty much from the beginning. It's somewhat slow relative to other implementations. There's a lot of things that Microsoft makes difficult. Jim Evans is the guy that's maintained both the .NET bindings of Selenium and does all of the code for the Internet Explorer driver. And he's done an amazing job with what Microsoft lets him do. A really exciting development recently is that Microsoft has decided to create a Microsoft Edge driver. They're not going to be supporting Internet Explorer with WebDriver, but they will be supporting Microsoft Edge on Windows 10 going forward with a native driver. And like I said earlier, Apple now has their own driver as well. And so it is only for Safari 10. And if you want to use the latest driver, you have to use the technology preview driver, and you can only do that through Mac OS Sierra. And then Phantom.js is a headless driver that's still supported, but it hasn't been maintained for several years. There have been limited updates to it. And if you feel the need to use a headless browser for some reason, please talk to me and I will explain why you don't need to use that kind of headless browser. Selenium 4 is going to implement the W3C standard for WebDriver. Why is that important? We have a W3C specification, so a number of Selenium developers and all of the browser vendors are involved in working on exactly what commands should be accepted and what information should be returned for every interaction with a browser. And every single vendor is going to work on an implementation of this. So theoretically, every single test that you write will work on every single browser the same way. And if it doesn't, then you can file a bug, and I'll try and fix it. And so this is great because everyone knows that has run more than one browser, which I think was most people when they raised their hands. There are things that are going to work on one that for some reason don't work on another. I can't, like if I click on the parent of this element in Firefox, it works, but if I click on the element which works just fine in Chrome, it doesn't work in Firefox. That's all going to be simplified. Every single browser of the major browser vendors participated in this W3C in the meetings on the committee. Specification is due, I think the charter for W3C is due at the end of March, and so we're probably going to get an extension. It can be complete once there are 2 implementations of the W3C standard. So this is not quick or easy. And so chickens and eggs, Mozilla is dedicated to supporting an implementation for W3C before anyone else. And that's why Gecko Driver is feature incomplete right now, because they have committed for Gecko Driver to only support the new W3C commands and not the old open source JSON wire protocol commands. And so essentially they have to write the code for the commands, people use it and say, hey, this doesn't really work the way you thought it would, and so they update the W3C standard to say, oh, these are the way these need to be specified. And it's taken a long time, especially for things like the more complicated actions classes with the complicated keyboard and mouse interactions. That's finally been put in place, and actually there's a brand new Gecko driver that was released today that should actually allow the Selenium developers to write the code that will allow you to use it in the near future. So API changes. Honestly, I'm not sure if or the extent to which the API is going to change with Selenium 4. The backend is going to be completely different, mostly different. The JSON commands that are getting sent to the endpoints and the return values are going to have a completely different structure. But what the user has to type in for each of the different languages in order for that to get translated to what gets sent to the drivers, I'm not entirely sure if everything that's currently in that code can be supported. And so we might end up deprecating some of that stuff. And some of the things, for instance, get attributes. The command for getting attributes kind of does a mismatch of attributes and properties. And for web developers, they know that that's not the same thing, and it gets very confusing. Which one are you getting back? The W3C is going to split those out. Are they going to be new commands? Is get attribute going to support actual attributes, or is it going to be backward compatible? Those things are still being worked out. But the exciting thing is there's been a lot of progress made in the last, well, even the last few months. I get emails of about 20 updates a day on changes to the W3C stuff, getting everything honed in and finalized. And so we're getting close on that, and as soon as there are 2 implementations of it, it will be complete. and then Selenium 4 will get rolled out with those things, and anything that's not implementing the new W3C protocol will be not supported until they implement that. But like I said, all of the vendors are working on it. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Mozilla. So does anyone have any questions about all of that data I just threw out? Yes?
Just to clarify, because of W3C and all the major vendors of browsers are conforming to that and providing us with WebDrivers, that Selenium 4 basically is going to be that point in time where we're saying, okay, we're going to sync up the Selenium core code to be in alignment with true W3C protocols.
That's right. That's right. So right now, if you are using Firefox greater than 48, the commands that are getting sent, every command that's implemented that you're interacting with that browser is W3C protocol right now. So often you have the commands being sent from your executing machine to a remote server that's then going to a driver that then is going to the browser. The commands that are getting sent to the Selenium server right now are JSON wire protocol, the legacy, and then from that server to the Gecko driver, that is all W3C commands right now. And so eventually, Google's working on implementation. Eventually we'll have a Chrome driver 3 or whatever they call it that's W3C compliant. And then depending on what version of Selenium you're using is what version of the driver you need. And we'll be able to get rid of even more code from the code base at that point. So anything I didn't convert? Yeah.
Do we know what the communication protocol is going to look like? I mean, you're saying it's not JSON wire protocol anymore, but... Right,
so it's the W3C specification. You can see what the specification looks like online, but also, the Ruby class, I have, a W3C capabilities, a W3C bridge, W3C options classes that have the differences in there. So you can actually see what JSON wire protocol wants this JSON blob sent to this endpoint in this way, and it gets this information back. And then the W3C protocol is going to be a slightly different JSON blob to a slightly different endpoint with slightly different response. But really all Selenium is, in each of the different languages that implement Selenium, all it is doing is taking the idiomatic language that you're using, that you're writing in, and it's converting it to little JSON serialized blobs that it's sending to a driver or another server. And that underlying code, the underlying, the messaging is completely independent of what you have to write in your code. And so it's just the implementation is going to be different, but it might have an impact on the commands that you have available to you.
If we want to run tests against IE11, I'm still going to have to deal with IE11 driver and their stupid native events for hovers and different things, and using a 32-bit driver on a 64-bit platform and all that kind of nonsense. That's still going to exist even if I do move to 3.0, right?
Yeah. So Internet Explorer is 3.0 compatible. Everything's fine. You actually don't get. We can talk about there's no real difference between the 32-bit and 64-bit Internet Explorer as far as the driver goes, and this 32-bit driver is what you need to be using, but we'll have that conversation later.
Yeah.
And also.
So my other question is, moving to 3.0 and maybe even 4.0, is there any implication that we need to consider around working with Appium and doing mobile testing?
So that's going to be completely independent from mobile. I think at one point they were talking about there is a mobile specification on the Selenium site that talks about the Appium. So Appium is essentially trying to be Selenium for native applications. And so what it is doing is it is taking Selenium-like syntax in each of the different bindings and sending similar commands to a node server, and then that server is translating it into the commands that the iPhone and the Android phone can process. But it's completely different from and actually they have updated some of that stuff already to use the W3C syntax. So some of that actually is updated more so than Selenium is right now, if I'm remembering correctly, the implementation. I know the capabilities use the W3C syntax, so I'm guessing there's more of that implementation. Darren?
Let's talk about XPath. So right now I believe Selenium is only using XPath 1 version, right? Are we moving up in XPath versions 2, 3?
I have no idea. Why are you using XPath? Stop it. No, and that's, there are a few use cases that that XPath gives you that CSS does not. The reason I always suggest people prefer CSS over XPath is because of the readability issues. There are a few things that XPath does that CSS can't. That's actually one of the design goals that I have for Water at this point. Speaking of test automation libraries on top of Selenium, is to make it so you never have to write XPath. The API will take care of everything that XPath can do in a nice, simple, elegant way without you needing to ever look at that those crazy strings again. I have no idea versions of XPath and what's supported where. The specification might say. I haven't looked. Yes?
So you mentioned that the format of the JSON that comes back is going to be a little bit different.
Yes.
So the tests that we're going to write against the JSON that comes back, are those going to change drastically or just maybe a little bit?
For the most part, what you're writing shouldn't change. Because what you're essentially, what language you use? Which binding? Okay, so the .NET bindings are essentially taking the code that you're writing and translating it into the correct wire protocol, whether it's JSON or the W3C, without you having to worry about it. But there are some things that, well, for instance, the W3C has decided not to try to define whether an element is visible. So the isDisplayed is not specifically defined in the W3C. But it's really important for Selenium users to know whether or not an element is visible to the best of a browser's ability to tell you. And so it is still going to be an option for you to make that command and get a response back. It's just not part of the specification and not officially part of what the browser is going to be doing. And so some things might not have that because they're not that important to Selenium testers the way that isDisplayed is, if that makes sense. Okay.
What are the other gossip, other things that you've been thinking about your head? What are the pitfalls?
Of what?
The W3C implementation, what's going on with the gossip behind it?
Pitfalls of W3C? I mean, the only thing is going to be there will probably be a period between when there is Selenium 4 and all of the browsers are adopting Selenium 4. But other than that, it's like the Selenium RC to WebDriver move. Everything was more object-oriented. Everything had the right command in the right place. You knew what was going on. It was a great change. And I see the same thing for the W3C. It's making all of the code in the back end look more simple and more consistent between them. So instead of just kind of ad hoc adding things, like submitting a string right now, like sending keys, turns it into an array before it goes across the JSON wire protocol. No reason for that. Just send a string. And W3C does that. So things like that, it's just consistent across the board. What would you guys like to see in future meetups? We're in a great position where I have a relatively long list of people who have expressed an interest in talking about various things at this meetup, which was one of the reasons why I've been trying to get this up and going again. So we've got some great things that we're going to be able to talk about going forward. What kinds of things would you guys like to see? What do you want to learn about? What do you want to talk about? What things interest you? What do you want to know more about? Process things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, and running your tests that way, parallelizing your tests to be able to run them faster and more autonomous tests. Talking about different test libraries. I talk about Water a lot, but WebDriver IO, and there are a number of libraries in different languages that we can have people talk about. So if you have ideas on subjects that you would like to learn more about, or if you would like to present something, please let me know. Just send me an email either by via Meetup or I'm Titus Fortner at Gmail, on Twitter, on all of the things. And anyway, thank you very much for coming out tonight.